The next few days could be crucial in determining what becomes of Crimea and Ukraine. With Russian troops conducting fresh exercises on the Ukrainian border, a vote is scheduled this weekend on a referendum in Crimea. If voters elect to leave Ukraine and join Russia, then what? In Kiev, the interim Ukrainian government says it won't give up Crimea. And despite saying they won't honor the result of the vote, can Europe and the United States really affect the regional map? The United States has threatened economic sanctions against Russia, but the big concern is military action. Would it be war or peace or something in between? It's a complicated story. In a few minutes, we'll talk with a former CIA officer. But first, to help explain it all, we begin in Crimea with CCTV's Stephanie Freid. Stephanie, thanks for joining us. So this takes place on Sunday. What kind of preparations are you seeing there?
Well, we're seeing the type of preparations that wouldn't be considered sort of typical preparations for a referendum, like ballot boxes being put up or schools where people would normally go to vote being set up. What we're seeing is a lot of security on the ground, and we're seeing a lot of people, a lot of locals lining up to pull their money out of Ukrainian banks. They're concerned that the expectation is this referendum will go through to ally with Russia, and if so, that their accounts are going to be frozen. These are people with pension funds and life savings in the Bank of Ukraine.
Are there going to be any kind of monitors who will be watching over this election and its conduct?
Well, there was the suggestion here among the parliament members that they were open to having international observers come in. Have we seen any sign of that here on the ground? Not at all. And in fact, 3 rounds of international observers were actually pushed out of here in the past week. I am not expecting, or we're not expecting to see any sort of what would be considered a typical international monitoring body on the ground. Those who are monitoring the vote here are the police and, again, these security forces on the ground.
Stephanie, let's go back a few steps here. What is the historic relationship between Crimea and initially the Soviet Union and then, of course, now Russia?
Well, throughout history, since really the late 1700s, Crimea and Russia have been intertwined, or what was then the Soviet Empire at the time annexed Crimea in the late 1700s. Since then, under the USSR, under Russia, Russia's basically been calling the shots in Crimea until the 90s, when Crimea went over to control of Ukraine via Kiev. People here say that literally overnight they woke up and they found out, oops, we're under the control of the Ukraine government out of Kiev, and they were none too happy about it. So there's been a very, very deep historical tie here between Russia, the former Soviet Union, and Crimea, and many people here certainly identify with Russia, which is why, again, this referendum is expected to favor allying with Russia, because the ties go deep and they go long, centuries long.
Right, as you say, people woke up one morning in Crimea and found out that they were part of Ukraine, and to some extent that move was sanctified in something called the Budapest Memorandum, which was signed in 1994. What is the Budapest Memorandum and what does it mean for Crimea?
Well, the Budapest Memorandum was essentially a diplomatic agreement between France, the UK, and with Russia as well, understanding with Ukraine that it was essentially a trade of security for nukes. This was the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So at the time, it was an agreement to hand over the nuclear arsenal in exchange for non-intervention politically in this area. That was, again, as you noted, in 1994. Now, on March 1st, we heard U.S. President Barack Obama say that right now the current situation and the Russian presence on the ground is a breach of that agreement. Those who are aligned with Russia would say, no, this was a diplomatic document, so there is no breach. And of course, Russia's not saying we have troops on the ground. So it's a question of who you would ask regarding this memorandum, but again, it was an agreement not to intervene politically in exchange for getting rid of the nuclear arsenal here.
Right, and there's another agreement between Russia and the Ukraine, and that gives Russia access to the Black Sea through the port of Sevastopol, which is where Russia's Black Sea Fleet is based. Is there a limited time that the fleet can be there? Do they have to move out at a certain point, or can that agreement be extended?
Well, originally the agreement that was signed in 1997 was for 20 years, which means that it would expire in 2017. However, 4 years ago, in 2010, that was extended for another 25 years, and it also comes up with an understanding that it comes up for renewal in 2047. So essentially, the Black Sea Fleet, which is a huge strategic fleet for the Russian Navy that's based in Sevastopol, which is about 80 kilometers from here, they have a lease agreement on being there, on staying there. And why is it strategic? Because that area is a gateway into the Balkans, into the Middle East, and the Mediterranean Sea.
Stephanie, thanks for joining us. Later, we'll talk with a U.S. analyst and a Russian geopolitical analyst. But joining me now is a former CIA officer whose career began during John F. Kennedy's presidency and spanned nearly 3 decades. In the 1980s, Ray McGovern was responsible for preparing President Ronald Reagan's daily intelligence briefing. And he joins me right here in Washington. Ray, thanks for joining us.
Most welcome.
So the referendum takes place Sunday, and indications are that the Ukraine, or rather the Crimeans, will be voting to be part of Russia. Does it make a difference to Moscow that nobody is going to be recognizing the outcome of the referendum?
Well, it's more than just a change of wording. They would be voting to rejoin Russia, okay? It's really important to know the history of this. When we were gaining our independence in the United States, Catherine the Great extended Russia's rule down to the Crimea, and that's when the Black Sea Fleet took shape, okay? It was an accident of history. You mentioned I was briefing Ronald Reagan's people there in the 80s, but I was around the 60s too, and I was responsible for Soviet foreign policy toward Eastern Europe, okay? It was an accident of history that Nikita Khrushchev, who was an Ukrainian, all of a sudden decided, well, let's give the Crimea back to Ukraine. Did it matter? Of course it didn't matter. It was all part of the Soviet Union. Oops, now it matters, because Crimea is a very important strategic asset. Sevastopol is the key to the Black Sea Fleet, Simferopol and the air bases and so forth. So what we have here really is a one regime change too many.
Okay, but does Vladimir Putin want the whole of Crimea back, or he just want to say, look, just guarantee me rights to the Black Sea port at Sevastopol there, and that'll be fine for me?
Very good question. I see what he has done as a big bargaining chip, and I see what's likely to happen early next week as some negotiations where, after the Crimeans have voted to rejoin Russia, it's not a done deal yet until the Russian parliament votes on that. And what Putin is saying to Kerry is, look, there's a graceful way for us to back down here if we get certain assurances. And the major assurance is, stop trying to make the Ukraine part of NATO, for God's sake. Now, when you look at the strategic situation here, it goes back to 1991 when the Soviet Union imploded, right? And they were very worried about what happens to the former Warsaw Pact states, because there were no more Warsaw Pact. And they said, look, you can have Germany. We'll pull our 20 divisions out of Germany, but for God's sake, you know, don't move NATO into our neighborhood, Poland, Hungary. Well, we don't need that, okay? And Jim Baker, who is the Secretary of State for George H.W. Bush, said, okay, we won't, you know. And then Bill Clinton came in, and all of a sudden, not only Poland, not only the rest of them, but constitutive parts of the former Soviet Union, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia. Now, Russian history, you'd have to know.
And there is some talk, I don't know whether it's a rumor or what, that President H.W. Bush, the older Bush, did give an assurance to Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand eastwards.
He did, through Jim Baker, who talked this through with Shevardnadze, who was the Russian foreign minister by that time, okay? So the important thing is here that Putin has good reason to feel tricked, okay? Really tricked. And then all of a sudden we have these blatant interferences in Kiev, where the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs is caught in a monitored telephone call saying, okay, now this is what we're going to do. Yats is our guy. I mean, she didn't even take the trouble to, you know, learn how to pronounce his whole name. It's Yatsenyuk, okay? And he's really good because he was head of the central bank, and he's willing to do all the things that the IMF wants, and so he's our guy. The other guys can wait in the wings. Now, one would have thought that the Americans and the Ukrainians would have been too embarrassed with that conversation on YouTube to pick who? Yikes, it's Yachts! All of a sudden he's the interim prime minister.
It seemed to have escalated very quickly from a negotiation over trade to the crisis that we have right now. But your bottom line on this is that this referendum that is taking place Sunday is basically a bargaining chip. It's going to give Putin a chance, a negotiating tactic, if you like, to say, okay, look, we're prepared to agree to some kind of maybe extended autonomy for Crimea. We'll go as far as that. You guys stay away out of Ukraine, and we have access to the warm water port at Sevastopol.
Well, a bargaining chip needs somebody on the other side of the table to bargain. And the people who are running Obama's policy are the so-called neocons, okay? They see great incentive to have a very bad relationship between Russia and the United States, and they're succeeding so far in this enterprise. Why? Because they don't want the Russians to cooperate with us in stopping war in Syria, okay? They don't want the Russians to cooperate with us in stopping war against Iran or figuring out some way to a modus vivendi with Iran. Who profits from all this? The neocons, you know, have great difficulty distinguishing between the strategic aims of Israel on the one hand and the strategic aims of the United States on the other. So they're running the policy. Now, if Obama gets some mature Russian advisors, there are lots around. Ambassador Matlock is standing in there. If he just talks this through with them, then there's a partner on the other side of the table. Then it does become a bargaining chip. Then adults can work this thing out. I see that as a hopeful sign, but it's not at all assured that Obama will have the stamina or the good sense to get some good advice on this. He still listens to these neocons.
You know, there is one point of view that says that this referendum that's taking place is basically electoral justification for a land grab. You're saying no, that's not the case.
Well, you know, the Russians are already in the Crimea. They were before, and they'll stay there. I see it more as they totally predictably protecting their strategic interests against a gratuitous attempt to wean the Ukraine away from Russia toward Western Europe and make them sort of part of an economic community where they'll get cheap labor. The Ukrainians will not really profit from this. The IMF, the Wall Street, the banks will profit from this by having Ukrainians part of an economic system that, well, look what happened in Greece. You know, there'll be Greeks for several years as they pay back all these loans and stuff like that. So, yeah, it's pretty cynical. And Putin knows that. And I hope Obama knows that, but I'm not quite sure what he really knows.
Ray McGovern, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for your insights.
You're most welcome.
Thank you. When we come back to opposing views on the situation in Crimea when the heat continues.